Good to see you, those I can see. I've looked around. I know who's here, kind of. It's always good to spend Sabbath with you guys, and it's delightful to be with you today. The parable, the teaching that we are looking at this morning is based on the parable of the unjust steward. And at its core, this, of course, is a story that deals with what we have been given, either by way of finances or responsibility, whatever it might be. This is how we handle, how we proceed with whatever it is that we have been given. But it is a fascinating and kind of crazy, complex story whose lessons are ever current and poignant, even for us today. Now, Jesus' stories are always creative, and more often than not, they are a bit challenging too, even at times disturbing. And this story is no exception. I seem to get these kind. One of the outcomes of my study this week was that I should look more carefully at the schedule before I sign up. That's my issue. At least in my opinion, this is a very challenging and disturbing kind of story in many ways, at least in my quirky way of thinking and what I worry about and what I think about. So maybe we should pray as we begin. Pray with me, please. Dear gracious God, Jesus once told us that people with eyes to see and ears to hear were fortunate. But those without those privileges that still believed were blessed. For whatever we can see, give us better understanding. And for what we must take in faith, give us real blessings today. And as we sit in the comfort of this building, and the relative surety of what will take place in the next few minutes, our hearts go to the people of France and the heartache and the pain and the devastation that has taken place. Give us eyes to see and ears to hear and faith to believe that that too is within the purview of your goodness and your grace. And somehow help us to know how to handle it, and them too, please. In Christ's name, amen. Okay, at the surface, Jesus' stories are pretty easy to grasp. He uses common subjects and themes, and he speaks in familiar terms. And of course, he's a great storyteller. But the real brilliance of Jesus' storytelling skills is seen in his ability to not only capture the imagination of his listeners, but somehow put them front and center into the story through a multi-layered mosaic of meanings and audiences and application. And we who hear today still, if we listen carefully enough, will always inevitably find ourselves somewhere in the narrative too. And we come to know that the story belongs to all of us, one way or another. Sometimes Jesus spoke in code, and even his own disciples needed to ask for clarification. But more often than not, his parables were rather direct and pointed. And those were the ones that often made the folks in the crowd a little uncomfortable, and some of them downright angry. Our story today is a wild mix of mystery and unmistakable clarity. And it actually ends with a group of Pharisees sneering at Jesus. Sneering, that's how the NIV says it. So for a better understanding of the sense of the setting in the atmosphere, I looked up sneering just to be sure I knew its full meaning. I had thought that I might make you all try it, but standing in front of you, I thought better of it. Sneering is associated with deep contempt and hatred. And it is usually accompanied with a bit of a contorted face and a snarled lip while saying disdainful, nasty words towards somebody under your breath. It's quite intricate, actually, and very ugly. Hence, I decided not to have you do it towards me. And that's the way the Pharisees responded when Jesus finished telling this parable about the unjust steward. And it makes you wonder if there's something we're missing, something we don't quite get. Maybe we should be driven to a stronger reaction too. Maybe this story is meant to move us to a deeper way of thinking. You know, it could be at the opposite end of the emotional spectrum. It could be that we're wowed with what he has said, deep in our souls. Maybe Jesus is always looking for a profound response from all of us. There is a real story, a real live story with real live people that surrounds this odd little parable of the unjust steward. And it is full of drama and indictment and anger, but it is also full of incredible truth, simple honesty, practical instruction, and real mercy, too. The story is found in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 16, and we are looking at the first 15 verses. You're welcome to go there, Luke 16, verses 1 through 15. I won't be reading it verbatim, but you might want to take a look and follow along in some sense. And by the way, Luke is the only one to record this parable, though he does throw in another little teaching of Jesus in verse 13 that Matthew also recorded regarding the difficulty of trying to serve two masters at the same time. And in this case, it was God and money or wealth. And Jesus says it can't be done. You can't serve two masters at the same time. And once again, money is at the center of the parable. This little story conceived and told by Jesus. And it might be good for us to ask ourselves why. Why was wealth Jesus' most often go-to simile when discussing human challenges and pitfalls as well as opportunities too? Now, to be fair, Luke does tell us in the text that these Pharisees loved money. So that is likely one of the reasons Jesus brings up the topic. But as it applies to everyone else, I think one of the reasons, the obvious reasons, that would be that Jesus knew that whether people had money or not, everybody understood its value and generally coveted its potential. In other words, you don't need to have money to know what it could provide and afford us if we did. There isn't a person in this room 3 years old or older that doesn't know exactly what money is and have a very positive and dominant value associated with it. So Jesus simply uses one of the greatest universal commodities to which the greatest amount of people already and immediately resonate with. And when Jesus talks of money, he always talks in excesses, large amounts, and inordinate pursuits. Not only because he is targeting the super rich, though that may be the case in some stories, but moreover, he is targeting an interest, a propensity, a condition of the human heart and mind that he sees, frankly, as potentially, fatally dangerous. Because money buys things, all the things the world can offer. And it provides position and power too. And maybe most of all, money provides a sense of autonomy, an independence through which we can all meet all of our own needs, our own demands, our own desires, without anyone else's help. including God's. The parable of the unjust steward has a long history of very interesting and varied interpretations. We won't get to all of them today. We probably shouldn't. But of great curiosity in this story is the behavior of the manager and the perceived misguided commendation of his crafty dishonesty. Here's the story in a nutshell. There's a rich man, and he hears that his head manager has been mishandling the corporate responsibilities. He calls him in and tells him that he is aware of the problem, and he demands a full report on the company's affairs. Once the report is complete, the manager's services will no longer be needed, and he will be summarily fired. Evidently, the rich man gives the guy a day or two to pull the report together before they meet again. So, the manager now knows he will lose his job, and not only does he have to write this extensive report, but he also has to figure out his future. He determines that he doesn't want to do manual labor. It's a cute story, kind of, verse 3. And he argues that he isn't strong enough to dig. Evidently, a gym membership didn't come with his managerial job. But he also doesn't want to beg either, because that's just embarrassing, especially after having the kind of position that he has had in this rich man's company all these years. So he comes up with a third option. He goes around to his boss's debtors and cuts deals with them, reducing their debt significantly. Now, presumably here, he has arranged for some kind of kickback from these debtors as a source of income once he loses his job. The only problem is that this is open cheating. He's stealing his boss's rightful income. And the scheme doesn't go unnoticed by his masters. But here's the crazy thing in the story. That rather than getting into trouble and being severely reprimanded, he gets praise. He gets approval from the boss from which he has stolen because of his savvy business sense. Now remember, Jesus is telling the story. And he's making it up. He's telling it exactly the way he wants to. And the story that Jesus tells is a story about a savvy, smart, aggressive robbery that gets praised. Okay, so is this finally the teaching we've all been looking for? Where Jesus encourages self-serving, clever dishonesty as a way to our financial security. The real prosperity gospel, right out of the mouth of Jesus and off the pages of the New Testament. Hallelujah. Or has Jesus somehow temporarily lost his moral compass? And Luke just doesn't know any better than to not include this story anyway. Or is Jesus making a point that will require a little more thought and study to fully grasp? At least for us. Because the Pharisees caught the intent with swift and clear precision. And in the light of the fact that we can't really find support for the first two options, we're going to have to figure out a way to embrace the idea that Jesus is telling this crazy story for a good reason. And it gets crazier yet. Verse 8 says, "The master commended the dishonest manager because he acted shrewdly. He is acclaimed for his skill and ingenious corruption." And then Jesus infers a comparison by saying, For the people of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own kind than are the people of the light. It almost sounds like shrewd, worldly people could teach these people of the light a thing or two. Jesus tells a story where clever, dishonest people get praised, and then he compares them to people of the light, and it's the people of the light that come out at the short end of the stick. This is the most fascinating part for me, and where I find the most amazing kind of mercy being exemplified. But we're going to have to wait just a bit to get there. First, let's address who these people of the light are. Biblical scholarship has taken various views as to whether the people of the light are strictly a reference to the Jews of Christ's day, or if it applies to Christians as well. Now, certainly Jews, with their history, have a powerful connection with light. God is light. And he brings light to the world through the Judaic story of creation. Further, God uses light as sort of a grand chaperone and guide for his wandering people over those 40 years wandering, searching, and seeking the promised land. And perhaps of greatest significance for the Jews is that they have the divine commission to be the genetic conduit through which the coming light, the prophesied Messiah, will be born. All of this and more provides plenty of evidence for the Jews being legitimate people of the light. But what is somewhat less agreed upon is whether this comparison has anything to say to Christians today. Obviously, we are people of the light too. Jesus makes that clear when he indicates himself as the light of the world, and further proposes in John 8:12 that anyone who follows him will never walk in darkness, but will have the light of life in them. Those who believe in Jesus are unquestionably people of the light. But we might hope that this story only references the first century Jews. Otherwise, we too are stuck with the reality that Jesus is somehow suggesting that we also might learn something important from smart thieves. In truth, there was a strong contingency of highly corrupt leadership in Jerusalem at the time of Christ. They were the chosen managers of the messianic promise. They were the guardians of the hope and light of the world. But the temple in Jerusalem had become a den of thieves, as Jesus called it. And Jesus calls them out as criminals, but not very good or clever ones. Apparently, they can't even do a good job at being bad. Can you see their sneering faces now? The story continues. I tell you, Jesus says, use worldly wealth to gain friends for yourself, so that when it is gone, you will be welcomed into eternal dwellings. Here again, the commentaries and interpretations of this warning are many. But in the context of the whole crazy story, we at a minimum see Jesus giving fair warning. This way of dishonest life, it won't last forever. You had better plan ahead, because the direction you are going now is ill-fated in the grand scheme of eternity. And then finally, Jesus says something that we can all feel more comfortable with, something that kind of fits his life and the preponderance of his other teaching. He tells them in verse 10, whoever can be trusted with very little can also be trusted with much. And whoever is dishonest with very little will also be dishonest with much. And this is spoken as sort of a given, a reality. This is just the way it is. You're either honest or you're not. You can't have it both ways. And he plants the idea that consequences have long-lasting and cumulative outcomes. And Jesus continues, verse 11. So, if you have not been trustworthy in handling worldly wealth, who will trust you with true riches? And if you have not been trustworthy with someone else's property, who will give you property of your own? It's a sobering story, actually. It doesn't leave a lot of wiggle room to excuse a little dishonesty, a little loose morality, a little careless living. Jesus sets the bar very high. Sort of an all or nothing kind of circumstance. You're either honest or you're not. You're either trustworthy or you're not. You're either with me or you're not. He said it more clearly somewhere else. He said, actually, you're either for me or you're against me. There's no middle ground here that we all like to think that maybe we can juggle. You can't have them both at the same time. Now, I get all of that. I do. I get it intellectually, and I get it spiritually. It makes sense. It makes sense even in our daily lives and our human relationships. This idea that you can't do two opposite things at the same time. It doesn't work. So that part of it really can't be argued. Jesus is right. But what's with the apparent glorification of bad behavior? How does that part of the story fit? Clearly, Jesus is making a point of some kind, and it can't possibly be that we should be better criminals. So why does he tell such a story and make the bad guy look somehow better than the people of the light? What about him is better? His wit? His entrepreneurial spirit? His willingness to take risks? To be aggressive? And to act decisively on his wishes and his convictions? To take responsibility for his hopes and his dreams and run with it? Yes, actually. I think that's it. Or certainly a reasonable piece of it. Many commentators unashamedly take this approach and exhort that we should all be so diligent, that enterprising, that proactive, that creative as this crooked manager. Just apply it to our testimony of faith instead. It's kind of simple. Jesus really isn't very complicated. He's just honest and very practical. In this story, too, the comparison is made that we work much harder toward the fleeting things of life than we ever do for eternity and kingdom truths. We're sloppy and a little unmotivated toward things of heaven. We should be so determined as this dishonest manager. But why doesn't Jesus talk like Paul? Paul says we ought to live our faith like a marathon runner. Now that's a positive metaphor. The only problem is that few of us are marathon runners. It doesn't even look appealing to most of us. Pardon my irreverence. I do admire the precious few that do that. But in the big scheme of things, there's a whole lot more people who would really like to make a few bucks in a crooked money way, and they would never be tempted to run a marathon. Paul knew it was a great metaphor for the folks in Corinth, but Jesus knows the lazy hearts of most of us. Here's the simple truth when it comes to Jesus. And I love this part. He always meets us where we are. And he knows us very well. He has never had the luxury of using people who had already gotten all together, who were perfect or even remotely close. He has always had to take us where we're at and then bring us along. And he is not above using whatever it is that we know, that we get, that we understand, the things that we resonate with, whether we should or not. He takes what we most easily understand and relate to, and he uses that. He uses that for his purposes and our benefit and sweet salvation. And we should be so grateful. Because that is humility and mercy at its most profound level. And it's God giving that to us. So don't be thrown by Jesus' stories. Every single one of them has you and your well-being and your eternal salvation at its very heart. How lucky we are. How fortunate we are for a realistic, honest, humble, and merciful God.